Good morning and or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Welcome. This is CX on the Rocks. This is our solution series, and we're happy to have you join us. Usually ends up being a lot of people that pop in a little late, so we're going to give that a little more time to work. But happy to see many of you, many familiar faces, some new. So appreciate you joining. Great topic today. Great opportunity to really dig in on some great research that was conducted. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Couple things while we're getting up to speed. I'm going to share just a little bit for kind of the recording audience. Uh, I want to recommend that, if you're not already part of the collective, need you to join. Love for you to join. We have the Kajabi platform. If you go to the site, cxontherocks.com, somebody give me a thumbs up. You see my screen? Okay. In this our website, we've got some information here. It's got upcoming events, but et cetera, past events. But the biggest thing is once you log in, once you join, you actually get access to the site and the environment. And this is where you can go. All of the past recordings from events are here, links to them. You can see upcoming and past events as well, and you can engage in conversation. So it's really built for us to develop the community. So if you haven't already joined, please join. That way we can make sure that this is something of value to everyone, and we'll be asking for some upcoming feedback as well. So looks like the pings have slowed down a little bit. So I'm going to get us started today. So today we're going to talk about building unbreakable relationships and talking about the research that CX on the Rocks did with Bespoke CSI. And so I'm joined today with Jason Tenpow, the CEO of Bespoke CSI. We're going to talk through this research. We're kind of going to dig into some of the, what it tells us and where we go from him. And as I admit a few more people, Jason, why don't you give us a quick introduction of yourself, your organization?
Yeah, so thank you, Sean. It's great to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. My name is Jason Tempow, as Sean has mentioned, and our organization, Bespoke CSI, we basically have a voice AI or AI first CX platform, and really, what that's all about is using AI to enhance the knowledge that we're able to extract from information that we collect about customers. And I'm sure you're all aware, AI is sort of the hot topic in most circles in 2026, and for good reason, because it offers a significant value in many instances. And we use AI specifically in sort of three areas to help with data collection, to also help with the analysis, and of course with reporting. So those are the three areas that we've sort of injected AI into the CX ecosystem to help companies build unbreakable relationships with their customers.
You
Sean?
know, and what's funny is, again, this is kind of a CX community, a customer experience, customer service, et cetera, community. And I've said this before, but I'll repeat it again. You take four letters, two sets of letters that are almost more misunderstood than anything else, CX and AI, because they mean so many different things to so many different people. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, about obviously to a certain extent bridging the gap between using AI for CX, but we're going to really talk about what it means from a CX maturity standpoint. And I'm excited to do that. So as we're going through this, we're gonna have some opportunities for you to ask questions, et cetera. But definitely, best opportunity is put in the chat when you have questions. If you want us to pull on a thread a little bit, as we have a pretty decent group out there. So I want to talk through that a little bit. So let's talk about this content. Let's talk about what it is when we think about CX, when we think about building unbreakable relationships. So talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. And one of the things that's really interesting that I've found interesting working in the CX space for, 20 plus years is that we're often so happy when a day goes by where we don't get that alarm through our email or a notification that something has gone wrong. And it's almost like we live on the edge all the time, where we're just we have our fingers crossed. We're hoping today's going to be one of those good days as opposed to not one of those days where, you know what, something happened in a customer's journey and now it's reached my desk and I have to respond. And those can be trying times. And Sean, you've been there. I've been there. You know, it's a visceral response in their gut many times. It's like, oh no, not again. What's even worse is if, someone has communicated this up the chain. So maybe it's a VP or a CEO even that sent a message across. It's like, oh, what do we do now? These are these moments that really, you know, embed in us the understanding of how important CX is. It's at those moments of failure. And Sean, I'm sure you can tell us some stories or, of just the emotion, the visceral feel in your gut when these things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and when you think about it too, this is the conundrum that, a lot of CX practitioners, because let's face it, a lot of companies think of those of CX, the definition of CX as customer service, right? And the conundrum being it is a constant game of whack-a-mole. Something goes wrong, we fix it. Something goes wrong, we fix it. The challenge is you never get ahead when you're doing that. It's a constant reactive mode. And I think what we're going to talk about today is CX maturity really switches the dialogue into a much more proactive approach to CX, right?
Yeah. And if we go to the next slide, Sean, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's two approaches that companies take when faced with, a challenge. The first one we like been called sort of the inner loop approach, which is we have a problem to a specific customer has reported an issue, and now we sprint into action, right? We have to do everything we can to now save that relationship. And that is when we look at CX through the lens of damage control. We're here to minimize damage, to save that relationship. And it usually we're like firefighters. The alarm goes off, we jump into our fire engine, we race to the scene of the crime, and we have to sort of take some enormous efforts to put out that fire immediately. And in most instances, that's how companies perceive CX and the role of CX and the role of customer service as a synonym for CX. But there actually is a complementary view of CX that lives within or outside of this inner loop, and it's the outer loop perspective. And the outer loop perspective is the view of CX as a roadmap to building better business. And through that perspective, you see CX as a strategy as opposed to CX as damage control. It's a strategy of getting in front of issues before they become problematic, of being proactive instead of reactive. But there's a price to that, right? It requires coordinated effort amongst a team of folks from different departments. And it requires a lot of data to manage, to understand, and in order to activate a set of priorities that we use as our North Star to guide our actions. And so many times, CX is seen primarily as inner loop, while the outer loop is ignored. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about the differences between the inner loop approach and the outer loop approach, understanding that they have to work together in order for CX to be maximally effective. But what we have seen is that there is a heightened prioritization on inner loop, while the outer loop is often overlooked. Sean,
Yeah,
anything to
it's
add to that?
the balance of the short term, long term has always been, where I know I've seen the struggle, in my practicing days, for almost 30 years, starting on the phones back in the 1900s, that it was always this balance of, if you focus on the now, you sometimes are ignoring the future, or if you're focusing on the future, then you're letting a lot of things break on the short term, and it's ultimately becomes one of those bigger challenges. In fact, I like to allude to it really as, CX is a climb. I mean, it's like trying to, summit Mount Everest. It is a major intake to try to do this because you're dealing with so many variables. And you mentioned it earlier too. The reality is you've got to get everybody involved. Everybody across the organization has to be aimed at this, this opportunity. We throw out terms like being customer centric, right? To really thinking about things and trying to do everything we do to be customer centric. Well, I've seen great organizations and been a part of them where they were very customer centric. It was a lot of conversation about let's do what's right for the customer, but it was like the Wild West. Everybody was doing so many different things that were actually making it worse because they weren't organized. And then I've seen others where they're really focused again, and they don't even think about building a culture. It's more task based. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that because I think this is really where this research shows value. And Scott, writing a book on how to service customers with just, yeah, exactly, with only so many interfaces or so many interfaces. Absolutely. And it's there. This is one of those things that we all are struggling with. And I think it's why CX is in this weird space right now because as we talked about earlier, AI is a big deal. And a lot of people are thinking of AI as the replacement of CX. And what we'll show and what we'll talk about is no, it's where these things start to come together. And I think that's where the power is. Well, I want to talk first just a little bit about the research we did. So, CX on the Rocks, the collective here, we partnered with Bespoke, and we really went out and did a deep set of analysis on CX maturity. But we looked at it, like we've been talking, more as a system instead of just tasks. And so we ultimately looked at a multi-dimensional model that we're going to talk about as we go through the session today. A ton of testing. I mean, Jason can go into all that heavy detail about the sources and everything else, but we're going to look across strategy, listening, analysis, action, monitoring, and culture as the main components of the model. And we did a lot of scoring and weighting and analysis and regression and all the stuff that I am not educated enough to really know how to do. But that's why Jason's team came in. And this was the research we did. And so it's founded in truth. And you're going to have a chance to download this report at the end of our session today, where you can see a deeper level of this report from that perspective as well. So Jason, when we think about this, let's talk about the gaps. So we've talked about this as a challenging area, right? So let's talk a little bit of some of the gaps that we see.
Yeah. And I think the gaps really start with leadership. And I know many people have differing views about where CX should live. Should it live at the grassroots or should it live at leadership? Well, it has to live from leadership right down to grassroots, but it's not a bottom up initiative, it's actually a top down initiative. And a lot rests on the shoulders of leadership to clearly communicate goals around CX. And that is where a lot of the challenge starts to successful CX. You can see here the data clearly indicates that leadership is not doing well, even clearly communicating goals. In fact, that's one of the weaknesses of CX is that CX goals aren't clearly communicated. And it's astounding how low the scores are in terms of folks that believe CX goals are being clearly communicated across the organization. And it only gets worse from here. If you take a look at the next data point, a big part of CX success comes from understanding the trends. Are we moving in a positive direction, or are we slipping, and do we need to do recovery? And again, here we see it's the leadership's responsibility to make sure that this information is disseminated across the organization so folks understand the goals and the aim and where we are in our journey. And that just isn't being done effectively. And leadership, and that falls squarely in the lap of leadership.
So we have a question here. Is it that they don't believe the goals are communicated, or they don't believe the goals selected are the right goals to focus on as a business? That's a great question.
And it's both. From what we've seen from the data, it's a combination of both. It's not the right goals and not being clearly communicated. And there's a lot to unpack around that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as we go into some of what are some of these goals. Um, and the third piece, where leadership again is really not being an advocate, but actually hampering the the success of CX, is that individuals aren't being shown how they impact overall CX success within the organization. They're not clear about the role they play in impacting success. So again, we see that these key pillars that leadership is supposed to be gathering around and creating this sense of urgency around, they're just not doing a very effective job. And so this is a clear area that we see that is causing friction, that is preventing CX initiatives from actually succeeding.
Yeah, I think when I look across these areas, I know I have plenty of examples of each, but again, we're talking maybe a third have positive answers to this, third of organizations. Communicating, right over a third for communicating the goals. What was interesting is that the trends are reported regularly at a lower rate. And that's probably the easiest part of CX is to report the metrics and the trends and the activity. But we're seeing that that's not actually the case. For all the talk about measuring and CX metrics and things of that nature, we're falling short of that in most organizations from a maturity standpoint.
And I think a lot of that has to comes right back to the fact that leadership doesn't understand how CX connects to revenue, profits, and the long-term game for the organization. And they're not good at articulating it because it's a combination of art and science and numbers and more and understanding and emotions. And so, companies like many companies try not to delve into emotions as much as they like the hard facts. What's a revenue number? What's our subscription goals? And those are hard numbers. When you get to emotions, people are, that are more difficult to measure, then leadership kind of backs off and questions things like, what are the goals? How do we measure these goals? And there's a lot of confusion around that, and that's where I think a lot of this comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, a great point. It's easy to measure, metadata at a high level, but really the specifics and getting that. Absolutely. You're speaking to the choir there. We're going to talk that, exactly as we go through this. So let's talk about the second gap, listening gap. We just talked about leadership. So now listening gap. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, listening is the key to CX. If you're not listening to what your customers are saying, how are you going to understand what actions you need to take? And so when we look at listening, the listening function It is. That's a very good point, Scott. It is. It's very difficult to measure. And one of the ways we try to do that in CX is use surveys. 70% of organizations say yes, they are using surveys on a regular basis to listen to what customers are saying. But there's a whole host of challenges as it relates to surveys. And we all know them. You know, you are missing the silent majority, right? You're not talking to everyone at every stage of their customer journey. And so there's a lot of blind spots that, are associated and with just relying on surveys alone. And so that's a common trend that we're seeing. So are brands moving beyond surveys? Some are looking at digital tracking, and digital tracking has been around for a long time, of course, but is it coming together within the conversation of CX? And not very often. You see, only 25% of folks are saying that's part of the data that they're looking at when they're looking at how to improve customer experience. Call transcripts, a huge opportunity for companies to understand what are the challenges and what are the points of friction, and to gather quantifiable data, right? Which is much more than just simply a survey response, but actually every person that has a problem, you can actually now articulate what that challenge is and where they're facing it and capturing more details around that. But very few companies are doing that. So companies are making decisions and taking action, but they're using limited data to inform those decisions. And this is part and parcel of their over reliance on things like survey and their underutilization of additional customer data that can be utilized to help them understand the challenges and the points of friction that their customers are facing.
Yeah, I think this drop off is crazy. Now, I think it's important to note that, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit. These percentages for digital tracking and call transcripts are based on using it specifically for CX purposes, because and that's why it's kind of a shame because the percentages are much higher for people who have the data but they're not
Correct.
using it, right? The digital team has all sorts of digital data, but they're not looking at it from an experience perspective usually, and it's not going to the CX team. And then call transcripts, most places are recorded and transcribed in many cases, but it's being used for just for quality, like for individual use cases on listening to calls, and that's where the challenge is. But it's also where those become more difficult, right? That kind of data is complex and really hard. It's not as easy as a 1 through 5 or a 1 through 7 on a survey. And again, that's where we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. But really, this was just kind of shocking to me because it's not that this stuff's not there. It's just they're not. Most organizations aren't necessarily using it the right way. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Survey surveys are responses are declining. They are. And people can argue against that, but the truth of the matter is time is of the essence for customers today. And they don't have the time that they once did to provide feedback. The world is moving faster than it's ever had. And whether it's the time or the inclination, the bottom line is data, capturing emotional data about the customer's experience is becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah, and I agree though with Dave, the customer behavior data is now more important than ever. Because again, if we can get 100% of it instead of just the small percentage, of declining survey responses, we're so much better off. Now, I'm not saying like some of my colleagues say that surveys are dead. I think there will always be a place for surveys. It's just it's changing, and it can't be the dependence that we all have. Well, let's keep going. So I know that the third really big gap we're going to talk about is the analysis gap. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. The analysis gap is if you don't have a lot of data, right? And you're looking for data and you don't have a lot, you're going to suffer. You're going to struggle. The second piece of this is that how you put that data together becomes even more vital. With the less data you have, the more vital it becomes of putting it together. And putting it together means having it in one location so you can create a single view of that customer's journey from the beginning, the middle, and the end. A lot of times we know what the end is because we have post transaction surveys, but that really glosses over what has happened to create friction across that entire journey. The second piece that is really surprising to me is that real-time tracking of customer journeys performance continues to be an area where very few companies have invested in. And 5 years ago, we were talking about, understanding the customer journey and how vital that was. But 5 years later, now we're looking at the data. And from a CX perspective, that data is not coming in to the conversation. And so we're lacking that comprehensive view of the customer. So what we're doing is we're making decisions and taking action based on highly fragmented data. And as a result, in many instances, we're attacking the symptom of a problem as opposed to the actual problem themselves. And so when we make a change and our scores don't improve, people question, why did this happen? And the reason is because you've attacked the symptom and not gotten to the core reason for the problem because you don't have access to that single view of the customer and you don't have it in real time so you can take immediate corrective action.
Yeah, I mean, only 37% have a single view. No, and I know we've been talking about single pane of glass, right? That was one of the terms like a decade plus ago that we would talk a lot about. And again, this is though not about a CRM or something like that. This is from an analytics perspective, the ability to really understand that single pane of glass or that single view. It still though is in some cases a little more snapshot, and it's the other half of that, the 34%, that absolutely um, gives the context or doesn't. Like when you're thinking about and looking at, the experience, you can look at it point of time and understand it. But if you don't understand what journey they're on, I know Dave will, celebrate this from a journey mapping and journey management perspective. But this is one of those places where it's understanding the context, who they are, and what were they trying to accomplish, not just the task that took place, because that's what people are most important to them. Make my journey easier. And if you don't have that, which in this case we don't know, we can't be proactive if we're not looking at kind of that real time journey content and context.
And one of the things that based on my experience that I've seen is that around circa 2015, the word data lake emerged into, the consciousness of many companies. And that was supposed to solve this problem, right? Clearly it hasn't, right? 10 years later, the issue remains the same. And the challenge back then was, oh, we're going to put all the data into the data lake and then magically we'll be able to connect it later on. The problem is once you put it into the data lake, forget about it. There's no way of, number one, pulling it out in any meaningful way, and number two, connecting it. And so this is not just a CX problem. This is organization wide has become an issue. And I think many companies today have concluded that that entire experiment of data lakes um, has been a complete and utter failure. And
Yeah.
it's just remarkable because we're stuck with the same problem we had before that data lakes were supposed to solve, and they haven't.
Yeah, data lake, data ocean, data pond, data puddle. I don't care what form of water you put it in. If you don't create it where it can connect and be useful, you're at a loss. It's not going to work.
Mhm.
Let's move on to kind of the next gap. The next gap is the reporting gap. So let's talk a little bit more about that one.
Yeah, the reporting gap. We're still stuck in the days of dashboards. Everyone's still using dashboards. Data warehouse, where right? So you have all this siloed data that we try to put together in a data warehouse, and you can go query the data, and again, it's all disjointed and don't know what to make heads or tails about it. And data integration, which data lakes were supposed to solve, continues to be the challenge today. And
Yeah.
so again, if the solution companies have been working on for the last 10 years hasn't worked yet, maybe it's time to think of a different approach. And so CX is failing, not necessarily because anything we've done, but the tools that were supposed to help us do our job better has failed to deliver what it was supposed to deliver. And as a result, our hands are tied and we're dealing with survey data, limited amount, and not much else. And as a result, we're putting what we can into dashboards. And as we know, that's leaving us with a lot of blind spots. And then we're forced to make decisions and take actions based on that limited data. And we're really it's the CXer is operating with one hand tied behind their back because without understanding the customer effectively, it is almost impossible to make the right decisions at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and what's crazy about that, because again, we just kind of talked about that, but what's important, and I want to go back to what Dave said in the chat earlier about behavioral data. It's not just this experiential data, like, getting from the transcripts and the audio, were they frustrated and angry, and what were they saying from that perspective? It's the transaction and activity data because it's all part of the experience. Everything they do, just like we think we talked about digital is part of that. And again, the lakes only go so good as integrating that data. But I think that's where we have a greater opportunity as we move forward, especially driven by AI and some of the capabilities that it provides. But ultimately, it becomes the need for an environment to drive this work to a certain extent because while I never advocate, when talking to consulting clients about customer experience, to say lead with tech. And in fact, we'll talk a little more here in just a little bit about why not. But tech is a part of it because you can't build a system and a program and without both the human and the technical side of that and processes to bring it all together as well. So we'll talk a little bit more, but again, when we think about the struggle with outer loop, let's just kind of reinforce it one more time.
Yeah. Traditional surveys feedback is sparse, arrives late, and misses the emotional context. And if all we have is survey data to help navigate that outer loop, it's going to be challenging. And that's what we're running into, like a brick wall. And so, are there ways to overcome this? Luckily, there are, and we're starting to see this being developed and implemented. And we'll talk a little bit about this shortly. But the reason companies are struggling with the outer loop part, it's the data that they have. It's the limiting factor that inhibits them from understanding the customer effectively and then prioritizing big picture actions that can suss out the core issues and then address them.
Absolutely. Well, and I think to that extent, we're going to kind of transition in the second half of this a little bit and talk more about that. But I want to call everybody's attention to the chat. So I just put those six milestones or the different measures of the model from a maturity standpoint. And basically, what these represent are different aspects that drive CX maturity. And I want to get some feedback here. So, taking a look at those, I want you to think about them and say, which of these, and I want you to enter that right into the chat. Which of these six areas do you think is strongest in businesses today? So take a second. Which strategy, culture, listening, monitoring, analyzing, and acting, which is the strongest, do you feel, in industries today? See a
And
couple
this
of
is
responses there.
Yeah, this is such a great question, Sean. I'm fascinated to see what the group on the bridge have to say.
All right, listening. Several for listening. Yep. One
Mhm.
for act. Any other votes? All right, switch it. Which do you think is the weakest? Strategy, culture, listen, monitor, analyze, act. Which is the weakest? Culture, act, strategy, listen. All right, we got listen is both best and worse. Culture, thanks Angie. Weakest, monitoring, strategy. All right, well, we're going to walk through these, what the data shows from our research. And I think it's going to be a little surprising to some folks, as we go through this. And we'll talk a little bit about the impressions of why that is from that perspective. So we're going to start at the highest
Mhm.
rated, the best, and then we're going to go to worst. And so we're going to tick these off as we go and see how this matches your thinking of what that would look like. So let's start out with the first one here.
All right. So great setup, Sean. Most companies believe they're acting. Okay. They believe that they're acting. Okay. And they're taking action, and that's their number one because they know that's their goal. They have to act, but they believe they're acting. Unfortunately, most companies are acting without anything underneath it as a foundation against which to form an action. They're like, oh, I need to do something. I'm just going to do it. Right. And that's where most companies are actually flowing from. I got a problem. I'm going to solve it. I'm just going to be reactionary. I'm acting. And most companies believe they're acting, and they believe that the shortcut to getting to the top of the mountain, to the summit, is through action. But there's no strategy against it. Exactly, Dave. You hit the nail on the head. But some companies, the next sort of
Well, hold on. I want to talk about that just a little bit
yeah,
because and
absolutely.
I
So
and I and again, this surprised me in the data. And Jason and I had a long conversation about this, but then I had to really reflect and think about it. All the companies I work with, they're doing a lot of things. But it's either not organized or whatever else. So I'm actually working with a company right now, and their problem is too many people are doing stuff. They're getting in each other's way. They're actually making it worse, from that perspective. So the good news for all of us from a CX perspective is they wouldn't be acting if they didn't know it was important, right? So whether we're consultants or practitioners, the fact that there's a lot of activity around the customer experience is a good sign. It's just that's not the lead. We should be leading with acting. So yeah, so the next one, Jason.
yeah. So the next thing is strategy. So folks are developing strategies and then they're acting. However, this strategy they're developing is not data driven. For many of them, it's just, I think we should do this, that therefore let's act. So it's devoid of any input outside of my gut feel. And so that's the second area where organizations are falling down. They have a strategy and they're acting, but their strategy is not data or customer informed. It's more gut feel informed and it's reactionary in nature. And that is what's driving action. And as a result, they're seeing limited success.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to keep us going here. And so some of these were the votes, So let's talk a little bit about the next one that's from a strength perspective.
Absolutely. So the third sort of approach is that, okay, we're listening. We're doing some listening. We're understanding the customers. We're doing an NPS survey annually, and we're letting that inject itself into our strategy. And then we're acting based on that strategy. That's better than just acting alone. It's better than strategy and then acting. But the listening, as we talked about from the very beginning, because it's generally survey based listening, it's we're getting partial information, partial knowledge. So that impacts our strategy. So our strategy is not as robust as it could be. And as a result, our actions are not necessarily addressing the core issues, but rather symptoms of problems that we're facing. And so this is the third group where, yes, I'm doing some listening. I'm checking all the boxes, as it were, for the fundamentals of CX, but I'm not really seeing the success. And it's because the data is not effective enough and holistic enough to inform the strategy effectively, and then the actions you're acting and you're addressing symptoms as opposed to you're really pushing properly. And then,
Absolutely. Yeah. I just wanted to load the rest of the page because I know now we've given it away, what the full build is, but, this is where the rest of it comes in together. And so I think looking back at completely, I want to go back to what Angie said, culture is the bedrock. And it absolutely is. So let's, help round out kind of
yeah,
this flow here.
when we start to monitor, that means ongoing, every interaction, we're getting some feedback, some information. We have more data. And once we have more data, guess what? That allows us to then understand we need the expertise to analyze it. And then when we understand, okay, we need to analyze it, we come to the conclusion that this, in order for CX to work, it's not about addressing singular problems. It's about changing the culture and the way we view CX, not as a reactive mechanism, but actually a strategy for business success. And it's only when you can see CX through the lens across these six dimensions that you truly understand the power of CX and you're able to experience the benefit of CX. Because we've seen lots of people say they're acting, right? But they're not successful. It's only when acting is informed by these other five things that the acting becomes powerful. And so acting on its own is not enough. Strategy, listening, all these things in isolation don't work. It's when they come together and move together that they actually are making impact and CX is improving across the organization.
Yeah, and again, if we think of this as a build, this is why we've got to think of it. Build the culture, build a practice of analyzing and monitoring and listening, then let that lead your strategy and your action, right? And that's where the greatest comes in. And so thinking, I always think of this in this metaphor of climbing a mountain. These are like the camps on the way up to Mount Everest, and I see culture as that base camp. It's where you start. from that perspective. And so when we think about culture and we think about, what it means and what it needs to drive CX maturity, it basically it shifts into multiple stages. And so as we think about culture, we talked kind of earlier in the beginning about leadership. Leadership is the prime, delivery of culture because you're setting the tone, the vision, the mission, the purpose. But leadership doesn't determine culture, which is the hard part, right? You can tell people all you want. It's what gets built together. Well, the only way really to do that is you start with awareness. You start with understanding and agreeing that we recognize, especially for CX maturity, we recognize the same issues together. We recognize what is happening. We recognize at an outer loop perspective what the main themes are and trends and challenges collectively from a community standpoint. Then it's, about alignment. We agree what they mean. This is one of the underrated steps in the process is actually saying, hey, um, we're hearing something, but do we agree what it means? And then ultimately, because of that, we can change the way we work. I've been in plenty of boardrooms with, leaders across organizations that hear the same message, but if it didn't get clarified at the table, we walked away and people thought it was something different, because it by default, we put our own lenses on that content. And then, of course, lastly, it's reinforcement as we think about this climb up the mountain, being able to reinforce what's happening and what we're working on and what the purpose is. Because when we get under pressure, which we all will, that's when we have to be able to step forward and say, no, we're going to keep those changes under pressure rather than reinventing ourselves. And that's kind of one of the other things I see a lot is people get stuck in the strategy act perspective. And so they're constantly trying new things. I was part of an organization that seemed like they did major reorganizations quarterly, or no, sorry, every 6 months, because they thought if we reorganized, it would help us. It would help us be better at creating better experiences, and that obviously isn't the last thing. So um, we've been talking about it a little bit all along. We talked about using AI to analyze. So take us home a little bit on on Jason on kind of the stuff that is so important today when we think about moving beyond just surveys into this other context and content and really driving both using culture as we just discussed, but then driving into that layer of understanding and purpose.
Yeah, and for CX, I really believe AI is going to be our secret weapon for success moving forward. And here's how. Okay. Number one, we know surveys response rates are declining. So every survey we capture, every response we capture has to have deep value and meaning to us. With voice AI surveys, customers can have conversations and tell us in their own words exactly what's happening in just a few minutes. And so, what that allows us to do is to get a richer context around the challenges or the friction points they've encountered and how it made them feel and why, more importantly, why it made them feel the way they did. You can think of voice AI surveys as a combination of a survey and a focus group, all rolled together in just a minute or two. And so every feedback now is supercharged with not just what people say or how they felt on a scale of 1 to 5, but also the why they felt the way. And then by analyzing the recording themselves, we can understand the intensity of their emotion as it relates to these types of issues. The second piece is AI can help in the analysis. Bringing multiple pieces of data in and analyzing it together is something that can be done at scale so fast now that it's unbelievable. For example, we can now analyze every conversation a contact center has and have the report that says, here's this unstructured data. We've now structured it, and we can tell you that based on each interaction, satisfaction is 75% for on average for every interaction that occurred today. So now we have more data than just surveys, and we can get access to it faster than ever before. And then the third piece is the prioritization, is taking that and reporting it at different levels of the organization. I can now take this data and use AI to help me summarize this for an executive versus an analyst that wants to know what are the three actions I need to take. So there's three distinct ways AI can be injected into the CX arena to help us help organizations make better decisions with more data faster.
Yeah, and I think this is where, again, this is where the world has changed, if you will, that this capability and the ability to again, take those lakes of data, if you will, and now start to actually act on them, using AI to study that at scale, using it to study transcripts and emails and chats and calls. I do want to call out the interview because, again, I know that's a new product really out there today. I know you guys have a version of that, and there's a couple other out there, but the ability now, when we think about surveys on the decline, I often say, well, why don't you have more conversations? And one of the new tools using AI is actually using basically an AI voice interviewer, where AI is talking to the customer or the prospect or whoever you're trying to survey, the employee across your business, and it's having a conversation. And so while taking surveys and clicks and scores is on the decline, I do think there's an opportunity of doing that. And not only do you in that AI interview get deeper information, it's easier for the person who's taking the survey because it's not all typing. You can actually just say your comments and your feedback. So it's a pretty exciting area as well that I know is growing right now. So
And
I
that
want to take us. I know we're getting short on time here. So if you want the full report, two ways. I got the QR code up, but I also just put into the chat a way to get to the report. I mean, we've shared pieces, little bits of pieces of the overall report that we did, and there's a lot more data behind this that we'd love for you to have access to. So CX on the Rocks is sponsoring this report for our audience for free. You can download it using either the QR code or the link. We look forward to hearing how you feel your organization, or if you're a consultant, the organizations you work with are fall into this area. This is again, this is a report that surprised me in several ways. And it continued to reinforce, but as we dug in and we thought about this in a deeper level, it really makes sense, and it helps translate the complexity of CX. Again, the challenge of those, what do those two letters mean for an organization? It creates an opportunity to help you as a dialogue builder, if you will, to really drive the conversation in the organizations you're a part of. And representing. So great opportunity. So I want to thank everybody. I know we lost some people about halfway through, but it was a great conversation. And Jason, closing words from your perspective for the audience here.
Yeah, I think, there's been a lot of rumors that CX is dying or going away, but I think it's simply evolving. And we have to be at the forefront of that evolution to understand that customer emotions matter, and where we can get that emotional insight is shifting. And to be able to say where it's shifting and then using that data to inform our strategies and decisions moving forward, it's going to be the secret of CX success.
All right, I'm removing spotlight so we can see each other. So it was great to have you here. These are our solution series really are meant every month to be about solutions we need in this space. And again, many of you are practitioners, many of you are consultants that work in the CX space, but we're here to support all of you from a CX on the Rocks perspective. This community is built around dialogue and trust. If you haven't been to one of our other sessions, the experience exchanges, those are actually built not as more push content like this. They're really built as conversations with small groups of peers to talk about top challenges in our space. And so we got these two sets of events every month. So if you want to check out what we have going on, go to cxontherocks.com. Again, I'll plug, please join us. There is a time in the probably not too distant future where we'll start just sending stuff out by LinkedIn and other means. And if you want to be a part of the dialogue and the conversation and the growth of the community, you need to actually be a member and be signed up in that. So I look forward to seeing you. Any other thoughts or as we close, any feedback about our session today?
I would encourage them to come to my session in March where we'll be talking about building a virtual customer, how you can actually chat with your research. A lot of times, qualitative research is kind of a one and done thing, and then it gets lost in the organization. I'm going to share my lessons from building a virtual customer to keep that research accessible and actionable across the enterprise. So, March 11th, I'll see you there.
March 11th at 4:30 Eastern time. So make sure you show up. And then the following week on the 17th, wear your green because Outsource Consultants is going to have another session. And that's going to be, I think, at 2 o'clock Eastern time. Those are the next monthly events. So we'll be sending out notifications about that. But again, best way to keep apprised of all the events, sign up and join the collective so you can see these all in your inbox versus hoping you see them on LinkedIn or something of that nature. So again, thank you all for joining. We appreciate your participation and hopefully you got a lot out of this session today. And we look forward to seeing you on one of the upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.